The countries around this table are 30 of the world's strongest democracies, representing almost 1 billion people.
Everyone in that room today understood the shared appreciation, quite frankly, that America is back.
All smiles as US President Joe Biden meets leaders of the G7 and NATO in an effort to reassure allies that America is back on the international stage. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Joe Biden wrapped up his first foreign trip as US president in an attempt to rally America's allies around his foreign policy goals at the G7 and NATO summits ahead of his much-anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Leaders of the Group of Seven, who met in the UK, made a commitment to ensure more equitable access to COVID vaccines to help end the pandemic and avert future global health crises. They also agreed on a corporate tax rate of at least 15% and pledged to work together on climate change. It was the first time in 2 years that NATO members convened for their annual summit in Brussels face-to-face. President Biden emphasized his country's, quote, rock-solid support for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which his predecessor once called obsolete. He also reiterated his commitment to the Transatlantic Organization's Charter and principle of collective defense.
The U.S. commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty is rock solid and unshakable. It's a sacred commitment.
The last time NATO agreed on a strategic concept outlining the alliance's key security tasks was in 2010. Ahead of the summit this week, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned of the growing political, economic and military cooperation between Beijing and Moscow, which he said poses new dangers for the 13-member alliance, concerns that were echoed by the United States and others.
We have new challenges, and we have Russia that is not acting in a way that is consistent with what we had hoped, and as well as China.
While NATO allies agreed that China's, quote, growing influence and international policies can present challenges, they warned that Russia's, quote, aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security.
Our relationship with Russia is at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War.
So how united are NATO members about Russia, China and America's leadership? I'm joined by Rose Gottemoeller, who served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO between 2016 and 2019. Before that, she was US Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She was also the chief US negotiator of the Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty with Russia, New START. Rose Gottemoeller, President Biden stated the obvious when he said just a few days ago that his view of NATO and the EU differ quite a bit from his predecessors. The NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, said, I know we can count on America and America can count on NATO. But doesn't all of this positive talk belie the way many individual countries within NATO, especially France and Germany, look at their strategic security interests, which are no longer as dependent on the United States as they once were?
Yes, you know that, frankly, this began long before President Trump. A lot of people time this kind of transatlantic divergence to the time when President Trump was in office. And in fact, that was quite a serious period for divide and division in the transatlantic alliance. Can't hide that fact. But actually, it was the pivot to Asia that President Obama announced back in 2012, almost 10 years ago now, that led the North Atlantic allies in Europe to begin to think they were going to have to do more for their own defense. And actually, I think that's a good thing because it means more defense burden sharing in the alliance. But you know, it's interesting. There's no question that we came out of 4 very tough years with the Trump administration, but I do want to underscore that this notion of strategic autonomy was in the works well before that.
It might have been well before Trump, but did the Trump presidency, though, make NATO less complacent? Did it make the US less indispensable?
Well, I think the United States is indispensable given the differential in the military capabilities that the United States fields compared to any of its allies, but it's the number of allies working together that make all the difference to that story. But honestly, I do think that Trump did give a short, sharp shock, as I say, to all of the allies and made them realize that they actually did have to pitch in more for their own defense. They needed to take more responsibility for their own defense. And particularly, Mr. Trump was very keen to see them pay more for their own defense. So it finally caused a lot of the allies to wake up to the fact that they had taken a pledge to spend 2% of their gross domestic product at the Wales Summit in 2014 on defense. And so, from the time I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO, both the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, and I thought that in a way it was a good thing that Trump was so insistent on higher defense spending, because it meant for the United States a more equitable burden sharing.
The tone and the optics looked back then like America was bullying some of NATO's smaller members. Can Joe Biden really turn the page? Or will there be more lasting consequences as a result of the Trump presidency, the lingering skepticism that goes beyond just one person?
Well, clearly there, I think, was a profound impression that came out of those Trump years. And so the allies are quite concerned. I do think that it's led to more allied responsibility, more really taking responsibility for their own defense and for thinking through what will be required for the future. This whole 2030 process in NATO, that came out of the famous speech by Macron back in 2019 in December, where he said NATO was brain dead because it wasn't thinking hard about the future. It needed to take more responsibility and be aware of what kinds of threats were coming over the horizon at it. So I do think that there were a number of things that came together, but part of it, the catalyst, was definitely Donald Trump.
But when Macron did call NATO brain dead, when Trump did call it obsolete, were these characterizations as outlandish as they may have sounded to some, or was there quite a bit of truth in them?
Well, I think there was a scrap of truth in them, perhaps, but only because NATO, I think, did need to pay more attention to things like emerging and disruptive technologies, did need to pay more attention to climate change. These are all issues that have been front and center in the last days at the NATO summit. And so I feel that Macron and Trump probably gave NATO a wake-up call, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has led, I think, to a considerable effort to both review the bidding and to look at what NATO needs to do, and now to really propel into the future. And so I'm quite optimistic at the moment.
But speaking about the future, there are some NATO members that believe that there needs to be rethinking about NATO and its strategy and its purpose. After the end of the Cold War, NATO had to reinvent itself. Biden is now trying to take the organization in a new direction, in a direction that leads to direct confrontation with China. Obviously, there is some resistance. Is it helpful when Biden uses sharp language towards China, towards Russia, but also towards NATO members like Turkey? There was quite a positive readout at the end of the bilateral meeting between Erdogan and Biden, forward-looking, conciliatory, but the tensions do remain after Turkey's decision to acquire the Russian S-400 anti-missile defense system. I just wonder if it helps the United States for the president to call out some of these leaders and to use certain labels. We heard him call Xi during the campaign a thug. We heard him call Putin a killer. Does it help, and does it help the standing of the U.S.?
Well, I can't speak for the president's choice of words here. He feels very strongly about these matters. Obviously, he has, he has met these leaders. He has dealt with them as vice president, and so I know he feels very strongly about these matters. He feels very strongly about the kinds of threats that are emanating from these countries. The cyber attacks have been terrible recently and are continuing apace. So I do think that from the perspective of the NATO alliance, it's important to recollect that with regard to China, for example, that it's really, yes, a state that is looking more aggressive. There is great concern about the development of its defense spending, its defense budget, modernization of its military forces. But NATO was also careful to say we will look for ways to engage also with China.
Rose Gottemoller, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We have to prove to the world and to our own people that democracy can still prevail against the challenges of our time.
As Biden focused on his central theme that Western democracies are competing with rising autocratic governments and urged America's allies to take a tougher line against China, the leaders of some European countries were more nuanced and reluctant to heed the US president's call.
I want to be clear. The G7 isn't a club hostile to China. It's a gathering of democracies that want to work with China on all of the world's issues on which China is ready to work with us.
The French president, who once warned Europe that NATO was becoming, quote, brain dead and should chart its own strategic path as a geopolitical power, said France will define its own China policy in the spirit of what he called strategic autonomy. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel cautioned against overreaction to China's rising influence, saying, quote, we have to find the right balance. There are signs of a widening rift between some European countries and the United States on just how much focus there should be on containing China's rise. To discuss, I'm joined by Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, an international forum established in 1963 at the height of the Cold War. Ambassador Ischinger is Germany's former Deputy Foreign Minister and former ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Ischinger, you hosted President Biden just a couple of months ago at the virtual Munich Security Conference at the beginning of his presidency. He said at the time what he's been saying now over the past few days, that America is back, the transatlantic alliance is strong. How convincing is his message to Europeans after the last 4 years and the skepticism that we've seen in Europe?
Well, you are right, of course, that a bit of doubt has crept into the transatlantic relationship. How sure can we be that after Joe Biden, we're not going to be confronted with yet another, Donald Trump? And quite frankly, that doubt will, of course, continue to exist until we see the next election results in the United States. But, and here comes a big but, I think the best person, the best qualified person that I know on the American side to dispel these concerns is, in fact, President Biden. Why? Look, I mean, he participated for the first time in the Munich Security Conference in 1980. Many of the people I talk to every day weren't even born in 1980. And if you leave out for a moment the Queen of England, I know no one around among the leaders that we are dealing with every day who has actually been involved in, top level foreign policy decision making for more than 40 years.
You're right.
That makes Joe Biden really special.
Well, he's been around for a long time, and as you say, among all previous American presidents, he is the one, perhaps after George H.W. Bush, that has the most foreign policy experience. But let's face it, you yourself mentioned it, there is that concern in Europe and in other places around the world about what could still lie ahead 4 years from now. So it isn't just down to one person and their upbeat pronouncements. Can Europeans really turn the page and trust that the United States, as a country, as a government, as a system, can still be that reliable partner it once was?
Let me turn that question around. What, if anything, can we do to make sure that we will like and appreciate the outcome of the next American elections? I think this is the most fundamental change in our relationship. I don't know how other countries think about this, but I know how Germans have felt about the transatlantic, the German-American relationship. We have actually not given much thought to whether the next president is going to be a Democrat or a Republican. They were all considered our friends. And we had great relations with them, whether it was Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton. This time around, we need to get involved. We need to think about what, if anything, can Europe do to make sure that the next president, or after the next presidential elections, the call, America first, will not receive that kind of a reaction that it had in 2016. So for the first time, we need to be interested in American elections.
Well, you say we need to be interested, and also there are growing calls among European leaders, the French, the German as well, about the need for what they're calling strategic autonomy, to show some kind of independence from the United States, certainly when it comes to relying on their security. On the United States for their security. Obviously, as you say, Biden is very different to his predecessor. But he has continued, hasn't he, some of his key policies, especially toward China. He's taken a tough line and he's urged his allies to do the same. And by some accounts, as you know, China is today the largest economy in the world. Can the United States simply ignore the fact that while it was absent those last 4 years, many Europeans have turned to China as a more reliable partner? Is it in the interest of Europeans, of Germans, to now follow the US's lead in confronting Beijing?
Well, of course, China presents a really novel challenge to the transatlantic relationship. It is a far more complex challenge than, let's say, the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, because we have multiple economic ties with China. My country in particular, the German companies sell more automobiles to the Chinese in China than to anyone else around the world. So this is not only about military confrontation or competition in high tech and in 5G. This is about the whole spectrum of our relationship. That makes it complicated.
Obviously, as you know, there are some who are reluctant to follow the United States and take on China head on. You mentioned the economic interests, and there are plenty among European countries and the EU. Germany has the largest trade surplus with China among EU member states. And as you say, it sells millions of cars to China. In fact, last year alone, the largest German car makers generated 38% of global sales in China alone. So unlike the situation during the Cold War, today's economies are intertwined. China is a major player. Is the new focus on China warranted? Is it counterproductive? Can Western democracies afford to alienate the Chinese?
Well, let me put it this way. You ask, of course, a very, very important question. But I think the answer is that in the past, German policy on China was very simplistic. It was simply, to consider China a country where we were able to export lots of goods. We have now begun to have a more sophisticated approach to China, and not only because there's some push from the United States. We do share the concern about human rights. We do share the concern about whether we can have a level playing field in trade and investment with the increasingly dominant role that China plays in many areas of technology. Think of solar technology, think of 5G technology, etc. So
But the question, though, aren't you becoming more and more dependent on the Chinese? Let's face it. I mean, 2/3 of EU member states are formal partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. So when you talk about a value-based geopolitical approach, many see it simply as an attempt to stop China's rise as a major economic and political player, and ultimately a military power.
Well, when you look at the wording of the G7 communique, and when you look at the wording which just came out yesterday of the NATO communique, and I have not yet seen actually the outcome of today's discussions between the EU and the United States, but if I take all of that together, the wording of these documents, of course, includes the willingness of all of us, including the United States, to work with China in the areas where it is in our interest to work with China. First and foremost, on climate change. How can we expect to reach the 1.5 or 2% goal if China isn't going to be on our page? So there are areas, and climate is only one example, trade is another one, where cooperation with China is not only desirable, it is utterly and absolutely necessary.
We could go on, but we'll have to leave it there. Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of the Munich Security Conference. Great to have you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, just ahead of Biden's trip to Europe, a poll found that America's image abroad had significantly improved following the transition from Trump earlier this year. At the end of the Trump presidency, 83% of people polled abroad said they had no confidence that the United States will do the right thing in world affairs. At the beginning of the Biden presidency, only 22% expressed that view. 75% now say they're confident Biden will do the right thing. But there remains a serious reliability gap. Only 11% of those surveyed say the US is a very reliable partner. 56% say the US is somewhat reliable. So as European leaders welcome Biden back into the club, can they count on the United States to be a long-term ally? I'm now joined by Jim Gilmore, who was appointed by President Trump as U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Ambassador Gilmore is a former governor of Virginia and former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Governor Gilmore, there was clear and quite profound relief in Europe to have Joe Biden and the United States back on the international stage. Boris Johnson, we heard, called working with Biden a breath of fresh air. Emmanuel Macron said it was great to have a US president who's willing to cooperate. Just how important is it to see this shift in attitude towards the United States, both at the governmental and public opinion levels in Europe?
Well, when I was the ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna, I didn't notice any of the so-called anger towards the United States. I found our allies to be cooperative and friendly and looking to the United States for leadership and frankly happy to have it. Now, I would expect the leaders of these allies to be polite to the president when he's in Europe. Because they have to live with him and they want American leadership. So I would not expect them to be rude. But at the same time, I think we have to remember what's really going on here. And that is that we are dealing here with an aggressive Russian state, which is doing very bad things, invading their neighbors, doing assassinations. And this is not a time for friendly get along, go along type of policy. So I would not be too excited about ththese polls.
But just half of those surveyed said that the US political system is just fine. In fact, this new Pew poll found that just 17% of the public polled in 16 countries said democracy in the US is a good example for others to follow. 57% say it used to be a good example, but has not been in recent years. Well, another 23% do not believe it has ever been a good example. So obviously, a growing number of people have serious doubt about US democracy and the US system functioning perfectly well.
And I believe that there are people that would like to hype that message and for political purposes. But my message as the former ambassador is to relax. The United States is fine. It was always fine. It was never in doubt. And I think that the actual policy positions and the strength of American leadership is more important than any type of message that comes through the media which affects the populations of foreign countries.
Isn't it important, Ambassador, as well, to show a united front? It used to be the tradition in the United States, certainly before Trump, that at least when it came to foreign policy, certainly in times of crises, the opposition would also show some solidarity with the president when he's overseas. That seems to have disappeared. Is something broken? Can it be fixed?
Listen, I think that things are fine with the United States. My experience as the ambassador to OSCE is the United States is always the biggest player in the room. We're entitled to work with our friends, and I did work with the British, the French, the Germans, and many of the neutral countries and people who are our allies and want to be our allies. The United States is strong, it's firm, it's reliable, and I'm not worried about what the influence is of people in other countries that may be influenced by very strange press, quite frankly. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is making sure that United States policy is secure and firm.
All right. Ambassador Jim Gilmore, former governor, thank you so much for joining me.
Great. Thank you very much for the interview.
President Biden is certainly on a roll. His charm offensive is bearing fruit among U.S. allies and many others as he tries to erase 4 long years of an idiosyncratic Trump presidency. But no matter what polls overseas tell us, the specter of a possible Trump comeback still haunts America's Western allies. Biden is also in a bind, with critical midterm elections looming. If he is too diplomatic, too conciliatory, Republicans will accuse him of being soft on defense, the Achilles heel of Democratic presidents. If he is too sharp, too confrontational, particularly towards China, he will provoke some pushback from European allies, some of whom are deeply invested in Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. And so, in short, if the US and the West won the first Cold War, it was largely because they won an economic war against the Soviet Union. Today's equation is more complex. The rise of China, already the world's largest economy according to some, takes away Biden's trump card. So when he calls President Putin a killer and Xi a thug, he does so at his own peril. Both are chess players with long memories, and both are leaders of major powers and civilizations who are being pushed deeper into each other's arms by the United States. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, from the entire team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.